I was buttoning my old captain's coat, ready to board the ferry to my daughter's house in Newport. 50 years to the day since I married Margaret. Then my phone rang. It wasn't my daughter. It was my lawyer. Breathless. Nathaniel, do not get on that ferry. They are planning to drop you off the cliff walk before sunset. What he told me next shattered everything. Before we go any further, I want to thank you for being here this morning. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because this story began the moment I picked up that phone and realized something was very wrong. And please note, parts of what I am about to share have been lightly dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental, but the message behind it is completely real. My name is Nathaniel Whitlock. Most people in Portland just call me Nate. I am 72 years old. And for the last 8 years, I have lived alone in a small clapboard house at the foot of the Portland Head Lighthouse on the rocky coast of Maine. The house belonged to my wife, Margaret. We bought it together in 1978, back when our daughter Charlotte was still small enough to ride on my shoulders down to the tide pools. That morning, the morning everything cracked open, I was standing in front of the bedroom mirror, fastening the heavy brass buttons of an old wool captain's coat. The coat was nearly 40 years old. Margaret had given it to me for my 40th birthday. The buttons were tarnished now. The wool smelled faintly of cedar and old rope, but the coat still fit, and that morning, it felt like armor. In my left pocket sat a small velvet box. Inside was Margaret's wedding ring. I had been polishing it the night before, the way I had polished it every anniversary for the last 8 years. Today would have been our 50th. Today, my daughter Charlotte had invited me to her mansion in Newport to honor her mother. To remember the woman who used to braid her hair and read her stories about the sea. I had agreed because I am an old fool. Because 8 years of silence between a father and a daughter is a long time. And I thought maybe, just maybe, the anniversary of her mother might thaw the ice. I looked at myself in the mirror. A tall man, still broad in the shoulders, with hair the color of January sea foam. My eyes were Margaret's favorite gray. She used to say they looked like a winter storm rolling in over Casco Bay. I picked up the velvet box, slipped it into the inside breast pocket of the coat, right against my heart, and I turned toward the doorway. That was when the phone rang. I almost did not answer it. The old corded landline was rattling on the kitchen wall. I assumed it was Charlotte calling to confirm the ferry. But something stopped me. Some old instinct from my Navy days. The same instinct that used to wake me up at 3 in the morning when the wind shifted in the wrong direction. I crossed the kitchen and lifted the receiver. Nathaniel. It is Edgar. Where are you right now? Edgar Pemberton has been my attorney for 38 years. He drew up the trust for Margaret's estate when she got sick. He handled the patents on every piece of maritime technology I have ever developed. In 38 years, I have never once heard him sound the way he sounded that morning. His voice was thin and stretched, like a halyard about to snap in a gale. I am at home, Edgar. Getting ready to head down to the ferry terminal. Why? There was a long pause. Long enough that I heard the lighthouse foghorn moan once across the harbor. Long enough that I felt the cold of the kitchen floor seep up through the soles of my shoes. Nathaniel. Listen to me carefully, Edgar said. I do not have time to soften this. You cannot get on that ferry. Your daughter filed an emergency petition in Rhode Island Family Court yesterday afternoon. Her attorney walked it through the on-call judge at 5 o'clock last night. The petition asks for an immediate temporary guardianship over your person and your finances, citing what she calls maritime trauma-related cognitive decline and progressive vascular dementia. I sat down heavily on the wooden chair beside the kitchen table. Charlotte, I said. My daughter, your daughter, Edgar confirmed. And it gets worse. The petition lists a specific receiving facility, a place called St. Cecilia's Maritime Veterans Psychiatric Hospital. Nathaniel. I pulled the records. St. Cecilia's has been cited 4 times in 6 years for chemical restraint violations. It is a warehouse, The kind of place men go unconscious and come out drooling into a paper cup. I closed my eyes. The kitchen smelled like the coffee I had brewed an hour ago. The same dark roast Margaret used to make. How? I asked. I have no diagnosis. I drove myself to the hardware store on Tuesday. That is the second thing, Edgar said. The petition is supported by a sworn affidavit from a Dr. Aldous Pemberton. Different Pemberton. No relation to me. He is a psychiatrist, out of Hartford. He has been the subject of 2 malpractice settlements involving what one attorney called diagnostic creativity. He is on his way to Newport right now, Nathaniel. Charlotte is hosting him for a private family lunch. She is presenting him as an old Navy friend of her husband. The ambush. I whispered. The ambush, Edgar agreed. He is going to evaluate you in plain clothes, over wine and lobster bisque. And by the time you finish dessert, he will have signed an affidavit, declaring you a clear and present danger to yourself. If you walk into that house today, you will not walk back out as a free man. I stared at the row of Margaret's blue ceramic mugs above the sink. That little girl I had taught to skip stones was going to put me in a chemical restraint facility tonight. And before you decide, Nathaniel, there is something else. I had a friend at the Rhode Island State Pharmacy Board run the database an hour ago. Your son-in-law, Reginald Vandermeer, filled a prescription yesterday under your name, a prescription you never authorized. The medication is called midazolam. They have already filled it. They have the syringe ready. I did not say anything for a long moment. Edgar waited on the other end of the line, breathing through his nose the way he always did when he was afraid of what I might do next. Outside, the wind shifted, and the Portland Head foghorn moaned a second time, low and mournful, the way a whale calls across an empty ocean. Edgar, I finally said, I am going to call you back in 20 minutes. Stay by your phone, Nathaniel. Do not do anything foolish. I have not done a foolish thing in 30 years, I told him. I am not going to start today. I hung up the receiver and walked to the kitchen window. The lighthouse was still spinning, its eternal warning, out across the gray water of Casco Bay. Somewhere out there, a lobster boat was already pulling its first traps. Life was going on, the way it always does. Indifferent to the small wars fought inside small kitchens. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass and let myself remember. 1975. The annual Naval Academy Ball in Annapolis. I was a young lieutenant, 23 years old, in a borrowed dress uniform that did not quite fit across the shoulders. Margaret was 22, a librarian's daughter from Bar Harbor, in a pale green dress she had sewn herself. She did not know how to waltz. I did not know how to talk to a woman whose eyes were that particular shade of gray. We figured both things out together. Very badly. On a polished wooden floor, while a Navy band played something by Glenn Miller. 3 years later, we were married on the rocks below this lighthouse. Margaret refused a church. She said God lived in the wind off the Atlantic, and that was the only sanctuary she needed. The minister read our vows over the sound of the surf. Margaret's father wept. My mother fainted. The lighthouse keeper, an old Norwegian named Henriksen, blew the foghorn 3 times when I kissed her. 43 years of marriage. 1 daughter. 100,000 quiet mornings. Just like this one. With coffee on the stove, and Margaret humming in the next room. She had been gone for 8 years now. A drunk driver on Interstate 95. On a stretch of road between Mystic and Newport, she had been driving down to see Charlotte, who had just given birth to Eloise. Margaret never made it. The state troopers told me she died on impact. I have never decided whether that was a mercy or a cruelty. Charlotte decided, though. Charlotte decided it was my fault. She said I should have driven Margaret myself. She said I was always letting her mother go alone, always too busy with my work, always more married to the sea than to the woman who waited on shore. At the funeral, in the receiving line at the Whitlock family plot, my own daughter looked me in the eye and said, "You killed her, Dad. You and your damn ocean." She has not called me Dad since. Just Nathaniel. Or, on the rare occasions she remembers to be polite, Father. And here is the thing she never knew. The thing nobody knew. The thing that made what she was about to do today even more grotesque than she could possibly imagine. I walked from the kitchen to the front room. In the corner, beneath a fading watercolor of the Portland Head Light, sat an old sea trunk made of teak. Margaret had bought it for me at an estate sale in Rockland the summer Charlotte left for college. The brass hinges were green with patina. The leather straps were cracked. To anyone walking through this house, it looked like nothing more than the keepsake of a sentimental old sailor. I knelt down. Slowly, the way men of my age must kneel now, and I unlatched the lid. Inside, beneath a folded square of canvas, sat a stack of files an inch thick. The top file was labeled, in Margaret's careful handwriting, Whitlock Maritime Technologies, Incorporated. I was not just a retired Navy man. I had never been just a retired Navy man. In 1985, 3 years after I left active service, I founded a small consulting firm out of the spare bedroom of this very house. We designed sonar dampening systems, quiet-running propellers for nuclear submarines, hull coatings that defeated thermal imaging. By 1995, Whitlock Maritime held 17 patents licensed to the United States Navy and 4 allied governments. By 2010, the company was valued at just over $14 million. I had never told Charlotte. Not when she went to college. Not when she got married the first time. To a decent young man named Robert, who she divorced within 3 years. Not when she married Reginald Vandermeer, the hedge fund manager with the gleaming teeth and the rented yacht. Not when Margaret died. Not when Eloise was born. I had let my daughter believe I lived on a small Navy pension and the rent from a fishing shack. I had let her believe I drove a 20-year-old pickup because I could not afford better. I had let her think, for years, that her father was a stubborn old sailor with too much pride and too little money. I had done all of this on purpose. Because Margaret, before she died, asked me to. She said our daughter had developed a peculiar relationship with wealth, and she did not want Charlotte to inherit anything she had not first proven she deserved. Margaret used to say, "Money is a magnifying glass, Nate. It does not change people. It just makes you see them more clearly." I had been watching my daughter through that magnifying glass for 8 years now, and today, on the morning of our 50th anniversary, I was finally going to let her see me clearly too. Beneath the company files, wrapped in a piece of oiled silk, sat an old brass ship's compass. Margaret had given it to me in 1985, the same week Whitlock Maritime opened its doors. The compass looked like an antique. It was not. The needle still worked, but underneath the brass housing, behind the glass, sat something Margaret never knew about. A high-fidelity recording device, a small GPS transmitter, and a single green LED that pulsed once every 4 seconds when the unit was armed. If they wanted a senile old man, I would give them a performance worthy of Broadway. But I would be bringing my own props. And I would be writing the ending myself. The ferry from Portland to Newport takes about 4 hours by water. Longer if the wind comes from the wrong direction. That morning, the wind came from everywhere at once. I stood at the bow rail with my old captain's coat buttoned to the throat and watched the rocky Maine coast slide past on the starboard side. The Atlantic was the color of slate. The gulls were screaming at something they could not catch. And in the inside pocket of my coat, the brass compass pulsed once every 4 seconds against my chest. A slow green heartbeat that nobody on this ferry would ever notice. I had called Edgar back exactly 20 minutes after I hung up. He had not been happy. "You are going anyway," he said. It was not a question. "I am going anyway," I confirmed. "Because if I do not, Edgar, they will simply try again, next month, or the month after. They will sand the edges off their story and find a different judge and a different doctor. And by the time you and I have finished this conversation a year from now, my daughter will still be a thief, and I will still be running." I am 72 years old. I am not running. Then at least let me put a team on the ground in Newport. No. Just be ready by the phone. I will give you the signal when I need it. What is the signal? The word lighthouse, I said. If you hear that word on the recording, or in a text from any number, you call the Coast Guard duty officer at Station Castle Hill. Not the police, not the marshals, the Coast Guard. You tell them Captain Whitlock is invoking the Echo 5 protocol. Edgar was quiet for a long moment. Echo 5 had not been invoked since 2009, when one of our contractors in Norfolk had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. Edgar knew exactly what it meant. He knew it meant gunboats in the harbor and federal agents on the dock. Understood, he said finally. Be careful, Nathaniel. I have been careful for 38 years, Edgar. Today, I am going to be something else. That had been 3 hours ago. I was now standing on the bow of the morning ferry, with my phone vibrating in my hand. An email from Edgar's paralegal had arrived sometime during the second hour at sea. I opened it. The file on Dr. Aldous Pemberton was longer than I had expected. He was 56 years old. Divorced, with a private practice in Hartford that operated out of a converted Victorian on the wrong side of Asylum Avenue. The 2 malpractice settlements I already knew about. But there were also 3 sealed civil complaints that Edgar's people had managed to scrape from a court clerk's hard drive in Bridgeport. Each complaint involved a different elderly patient. Each one used the phrase, rapid vascular decline. Each one had resulted in the patient being committed within 72 hours of the first consultation. Each one had ended with the patient's adult children obtaining legal control of their finances within 90 days. He was good at this. He was very, very good. I closed the email and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The Rhode Island coastline was starting to appear off the bow, low and green, with the bell towers of Newport rising out of the haze. Somewhere down there, my daughter was preparing a lunch. I let my eyes go a little soft and unfocused. I let my shoulders drop forward. Not all the way. Just enough to suggest a man who has spent too many years carrying something heavy. I practiced a small tremor in my left hand, the kind of tremor that came and went, the kind a doctor might describe as essential or early stage. I let my mouth fall open just slightly when I breathed. I thought about the last time my daughter had called me Daddy. She had been 12 years old. It was a summer afternoon, July, and I had taken her out on a small Boston whaler to learn how to read a nautical chart. She had been terrible at it. She kept confusing the green buoys with the red ones, kept holding the chart upside down. She had finally thrown the whole thing into the bottom of the boat and burst into tears, and she had said, Daddy, I will never be a sailor like you. And I had pulled her into my lap and told her that the world needed all kinds of people, and that the ocean did not care whether she could read a chart or not. The ocean would love her anyway. She had not called me Daddy since that summer. Not once. She had become a young woman who corrected her own pronunciation, who married a man who wore a Patek Philippe and called everyone darling, who looked at her father's clapboard house and said, with a small, tight smile, It is so authentic, Dad. So very you. The ferry blew its horn 3 times. We were sliding past Pier 14 now, and there she was. Aurora Borealis. Reginald Vandermeer's $2.3 million floating advertisement for everything wrong with my son-in-law. She was 112 feet long, white as a wedding cake, with smoked glass windows and a helipad on the upper deck. From this distance, in this light, with the gulls circling her stern, she did not look like a yacht. She looked like a beautiful prison. The ferry docked. I led an older couple ahead of me on the gangway. I shuffled. I gripped the handrail with both hands, as if I were not entirely sure where the next step would be. I was, by the time my shoes touched the pier, an entirely different man than the one who had stood at the bow. Charlotte was waiting near the terminal building. She was wearing pearls. My breath caught when I saw them. They were Margaret's pearls, the 3-strand choker I had given her in 1990 for our 20th anniversary. Margaret had left them to Charlotte in her will, of course. But somehow it had never occurred to me that Charlotte would wear them. That she would wear them today. To this lunch, as if to remind me, before I had even said hello, of exactly what she had inherited. And exactly what I had not been able to keep. Her smile, when she saw me, did not reach her eyes. "Daddy," she said. "You made it." It was the first time she had called me daddy in 33 years. Beside her, Reggie was already striding forward with his hand outstretched, his teeth bright in the noon sun. "Pop," he said, in a voice loud enough for two strangers nearby to glance over. "We were starting to think you got lost. Come on, the car is right here. Let us get you out of this wind." He took my elbow with a grip just a little too firm to be helpful. 20 minutes later, the Range Rover pulled through the iron gates of the Vandermeer estate. The mansion stood at the top of a long crushed-shell driveway, 3 stories of white clapboard and black shutters, with a view of the Atlantic that I had paid for and Charlotte did not know I owned. The front door was already open. A man stood in the doorway. He had wire-rimmed glasses, a navy blue blazer, and the slow, evaluating smile of a banker holding a counterfeit bill. Dr. Aldous Pemberton had been waiting for me. His handshake was a slow burn. He held my hand 3 full seconds longer than any honest man should, the way a banker holds a counterfeit bill up to the light before declaring it fake. His fingers were cool and dry, his thumb pressed against the back of my hand, just above the knuckle, feeling for tremor, for muscle tone, for the small involuntary tells of a brain in decline. I let my hand sit limp in his. I let my grip be soft and uncertain. I let him have exactly what he was looking for. "Mr. Whitlock," he said. His voice was the practiced baritone of a man who had spent 30 years convincing people to sign things. "Reggie has told me so much about you. I am Dr. Aldous Pemberton, an old Navy friend of his from his consulting days at Groton. He had never been a Navy consultant. He had never been within 50 miles of Groton." I let my eyes drift to a point somewhere behind his left ear. "Pleasure," I mumbled. Charlotte appeared at his elbow with a bright, fluttering smile. "Daddy, let us all sit down in the front room before lunch." Dr. Pemberton brought a beautiful bottle of something from his cellar. She led me by the arm. Her grip was not as firm as Reggie's, but it was guiding, the way you guide a horse that does not know where it is going. The front room of the Vandermeer estate looked like a magazine spread. White couches, a marble fireplace, a coffee table made from a single slab of polished teak. Above the mantel hung an enormous oil painting of a clipper ship under full sail. I had given that painting to Margaret on our 30th anniversary. It had hung in our bedroom in Portland for 20 years. Charlotte had taken it out of the house the week after the funeral. Dr. Pemberton lowered himself onto the couch across from me. He set a small leather notebook on his knee. He did not open it yet. That, I knew, was part of the technique. The notebook was a prop. It would come out later, when the patient had relaxed. "So, Mr. Whitlock," he began. "Reggie tells me you spent some time in the Navy. Surface fleet, was it? Destroyers," I said. "A long time ago. Marvelous. Do you still keep up with the old charts?" "I do a bit of recreational sailing myself, you understand. Out of Stonington. I always find it humbling, how much there is to remember. Buoys, depth markings, currents. Tell me, Mr. Whitlock, if you were leaving Newport Harbor headed east, which side would you keep the green buoys on?" The correct answer was port. Red right returning, green right going. Every child of the Atlantic coast learns this before they learn to ride a bicycle. I let my brow furrow. I let my eyes drift to the painting above the mantel. I let 3 full seconds tick by. "Starboard," I said softly. "I keep them on the starboard side." Dr. Pemberton's pen had already moved before I finished the sentence. He had not opened the notebook. He had simply slid the pen against his trouser leg, the way a man might idly mark a tally. Across the room, Reggie was leaning against the doorframe with his hands in his pockets. The right pocket was glowing faintly. A small green LED, partially shielded by the fabric, pulsing the unmistakable rhythm of an active recording. He was taping me. Of course he was taping me. They would use every wrong answer as exhibit material at Monday's hearing. What I do not think any of them understood, sitting there in their cream-colored room with their cream-colored confidence, was that I had a recorder too. And mine was older. And mine was better. And mine had been pulsing against my chest since I stepped off the ferry. "Lunch is ready," Charlotte called from the dining room. "Daddy, come sit at the head of the table." I did not sit at the head of the table. She placed me at the end, farthest from her, between Reggie and the doctor, with my back to a window that looked out at the Atlantic. The table itself was an enormous slab of bleached oak. The other place settings glittered with heavy sterling silver, the good Whitlock silver, my grandmother's silver, which Margaret had inherited, and which Charlotte had taken from our house in Portland the year after Margaret died. Each setting had a polished knife, a fork, 3 different spoons. Each setting had a delicate piece of bone china and a hand-blown wine glass. Each setting except mine. At my place sat a single shallow bowl of what appeared to be lobster bisque, gone almost cold, the surface starting to skin over. Beside the bowl lay a pair of bright blue plastic chopsticks, the cheap kind you might find at a children's birthday party, and a single white plastic spoon. There was no knife. There was no fork. There was no wine glass. There was a small, clear plastic tumbler, the kind you would give a toddler, half filled with tap water. "We thought tonight you would prefer something lighter, Daddy," Charlotte said, settling into her chair. She did not look at me. "I asked the chef to chill the bisque a little, so you do not burn yourself. And I had him slice your appetizer very small, you know, so you do not choke. The chopsticks are easier than the silver. Less to manage." Reggie smiled at his soup. Dr. Pemberton clicked his pen. I picked up the blue plastic chopsticks. My hand shook. Only a little, but enough. I aimed for a small piece of seared tuna on the bisque's chilled surface. The chopsticks slipped. The tuna landed in my lap. I let out a small, helpless sound. Across the table, Reggie laughed. It was not a kind laugh. That was when she walked into the room. My granddaughter Eloise, 16 years old. Tall now, taller than her mother. Her hair was the dark gold of beach sand at low tide. And her eyes, when she looked at me, were Margaret's eyes. The exact same gray. The exact same shape. She had not seen me in 3 years. She had not been allowed to. She did not say hello. She slid into the empty chair at my right elbow without looking at her parents. She placed her napkin on her lap, and then, beneath the table, where Dr. Pemberton could not see, she reached over and slid her warm hand into mine. She squeezed once. And she pressed something small and folded into my palm, a piece of paper. "So, Mr. Whitlock," Dr. Pemberton said brightly, sipping his wine, "tell me, do you ever still see Margaret? In dreams, I mean. People your age, after a loss, sometimes report very vivid visitations." I did not answer him. I was looking at Eloise. She had not lifted her eyes from her plate, but her lips had parted. And in a voice so soft that only I could hear, she said 5 words. "Is tonight when Grandpa disappears?" That was what she said. 5 small words, no louder than a tea kettle just beginning to whistle, spoken into the polished oak of the dining table, while her eyes stayed locked on her untouched bisque. For 1 full second, nothing happened. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked. A gull cried somewhere outside the window. The ice cubes in Charlotte's water glass settled with a small, sharp sound. And then the air in the room died. Charlotte's fork, which had been suspended halfway to her mouth, dropped onto her bone china plate with a noise like a small bell breaking. A pale wedge of seared scallop slid off the tines and onto the white tablecloth, leaving a stain of citrus butter. She did not move to pick it up. She did not move at all. Her face had gone the color of dirty milk. Dr. Pemberton's pen stopped moving. For the first time since I had walked through the front door, his eyes left mine. He looked, very slowly, At my son-in-law. Reggie made a sound that was supposed to be a laugh. It came out as a small, dry cough. Sweetheart, he said. His voice was too loud, too cheerful. The voice of a man trying to convince a panicking crowd that the smoke was nothing. What are you talking about? Grandpa is just visiting. He is here for the anniversary lunch. Honestly, where do you get these ideas? Eloise had not lifted her eyes from her plate. Her hand was still in mine, beneath the table, and I could feel it trembling. The folded note she had pressed into my palm was a small, hard knot of paper between our fingers. She was 16 years old and she was terrified, and she had just done the bravest thing I had ever seen anyone do at a dinner table. I heard you, she said. Her voice was a little stronger now. Last week, in the kitchen. After Mr. Pemberton came by for the meeting, you said after the boat dinner on Saturday, we would not have to worry about Grandpa anymore. You said Mom would not have to keep pretending. You said the words, Eloise. Charlotte hissed. Her color was coming back, but it was coming back wrong, in two bright spots high on her cheekbones. That is enough. You said the words, Mom. That is enough. Dr. Pemberton lifted both his hands in a small, placating gesture, the way an experienced trial witness will gesture when the cross-examination has begun to slide off the rails. Children, he said very gently, often misunderstand the texture of adult conversations. I am sure your parents were discussing a logistical matter, travel arrangements, a surprise of some kind. Yes, Reggie said quickly, leaping onto the doctor's lifeline. That is exactly it. A surprise. We were planning a surprise for Grandpa. For after lunch, I tilted my head very slightly. I let my mouth fall a little open. I let the confusion of a man who could not quite track the conversation settle across my features. A surprise, I said softly. For me. Yes, Daddy, Charlotte said. She had recovered now. Her voice had that bright, thin shellac she used when she was lying to her own reflection. We were going to surprise you with a little family cruise on Reggie's boat this evening, to celebrate the anniversary. Just our family. Just the four of us. Dr. Pemberton, of course. As our dear friend. Eloise's hand tightened around mine until my knuckles ached. How lovely, I murmured. The Atlantic at sunset. Margaret would have liked that. I have not been on a boat in a long time, I added, frowning at the bisque. I think I get seasick now. Do I? A small mercy of dementia is that you can ask anyone whether you get seasick, and they cannot prove you wrong. Dr. Pemberton wrote something in his notebook. I caught the words, in a clean blue script. Patient demonstrates uncertainty about basic somatic self-knowledge. Charlotte stood up. The legs of her chair scraped against the limestone floor with a small shriek. Eloise, she said. Go to your room. Now, Mom. Now, Eloise. The girl held my hand for one more second beneath the table. Then she released it. She stood up slowly, the way a person stands at a funeral, and she walked out of the dining room with her chin up and her eyes shining. She did not run. She did not look back. The folded note she had given me was still curled inside my closed fist. Reggie cleared his throat. Well, he said. Teenagers. Am I right, Doctor? So dramatic. So suggestible. Adolescent magical thinking, Dr. Pemberton agreed smoothly, returning his attention to me. Highly common at her age. Mr. Whitlock, do not let it trouble you. Now, I was asking about Margaret, was I not? But Reggie had already shifted in his chair, looking for an escape, the way a man looks at the exits when he has felt the first small tremor underfoot. Tell you what, Pop, he said. Why do we not let Charlotte get the kitchen squared away, and you and I go take that little tour of the Aurora I promised you? Get you some sea air before the surprise cruise. The bisque will keep, Char. Will it not? Charlotte's eyes met his across the table. Something passed between them. Very fast. The kind of look married people develop after years of negotiating in front of company. Yes, she said. Take Daddy down to the boat. Show him the upper deck. Dr. Pemberton and I will visit out here. I am not sure I should go alone, I said hesitantly. Reggie, you know I get a little turned around in unfamiliar places. I will be with you the entire time, Pop. Reggie was already standing. I will hold your elbow on the gangway and everything. Come on. Up we go. I let him pull me to my feet. I let him guide me down the long hallway, past the front parlor and the powder room, out the side door, and across the crushed shell drive to the 4-door Range Rover. He helped me up into the passenger seat, very solicitously, the way a hunting guide will help an elderly client into a tree stand. He buckled my seatbelt for me. He patted my shoulder. Just a quick tour, Pop, he said. Then we will get you settled. As soon as he closed his own door and started the engine, I let my hand open in my lap. Just for an instant, I unfolded the note Eloise had pressed into my palm. There were 3 words on it, written in a girl's quick, anxious handwriting. They have a syringe. I refolded the note. I slid it into the inside pocket of my coat, against the brass compass. Reggie pulled up to the gangway of the Aurora Borealis 10 minutes later. He helped me out of the Range Rover. He led me down the floating dock to the polished mahogany boarding plank. He stepped on first, turned, and offered me his hand. I took it. I shuffled across. He turned the handle of the main cabin door. He opened it with the wide, white grin of a man who did not yet know he was opening his own coffin. The Aurora Borealis smelled of teakwood polish, fresh leather, and something underneath that I recognized from 40 years at sea, the faint, sour breath of a vessel whose bilge pumps had not been serviced in at least 18 months. A $2.3 million yacht should not smell like that. A $2.3 million yacht that belonged to a man who could actually afford it would never smell like that. Reggie stepped through the cabin door ahead of me, spreading his arms like a game show host revealing the grand prize. Pop, take a look at her. Italian leather, Brazilian rosewood, hand-laid teak from a single tree in Burma. She's a queen, isn't she? I let my mouth fall slightly open. The way an old man might, when shown something beyond his comprehension. I made my eyes wander. Unfocused. Across the salon, past the curved sofa in cream leather, past the bar, stocked with 3 bottles of Macallan 18, past the framed nautical chart of Narragansett Bay hanging slightly crooked above the navigation console. Inside the breast pocket of my captain's coat, the brass compass sat warm against my ribs, its tiny green LED blinking once every 4 seconds. Recording. Always recording. She's beautiful, Reginald, I said, letting my voice tremble a half step. She's just beautiful. Did you build her yourself? Reggie laughed that braying laugh I had come to despise over 12 Thanksgivings. Build her? Pop, nobody builds these. You commission them. Ferretti Group. Italy. Took 14 months. He puffed his chest. She was a gift to myself. Reward for closing the Hartford deal last spring. There had been no Hartford deal. I knew this because Edgar had pulled Reginald Vandermeer's professional history 3 weeks ago, after Eloise's birthday card had arrived with a single underlined sentence, Grandpa, please come visit soon. Reggie had not closed a deal worth more than $90,000 in 2 years. His commercial real estate firm, Vandermeer Holdings, LLC, was 3 months behind on its office lease in downtown Newport. I shuffled toward the navigation console, dragging my left foot just slightly, the way Dr. Pemberton would expect a man with early vascular dementia to walk. Where do you keep the wheel? I used to sail. Did I ever tell you? I used to sail. About 100 times, Pop. Reggie was already turning toward the bar. Hey, let me pour us a Macallan. You like Macallan, right? Charlotte said you used to drink it with Mom. The word Mom applied to Margaret, by a man Margaret had met exactly twice before she died, landed in my chest like a thrown stone. I kept my face slack. Margaret liked the 18. She said the 12 was for tourists. Good memory, Pop. His back was to me now. 2 heavy crystal tumblers clinking in his hands. Real good memory. He had no idea how good. "Reginald," I said, putting just enough quaver into the syllables. "Would you mind terribly the bathroom? The boat ride. My bladder isn't what it was." "Down the corridor. Second door on the left. Past the office. Don't touch anything in the office, Pop. That's my work stuff. 5 minutes, all right?" 5 minutes and we toast. 5 minutes, I agreed. I shuffled down the corridor, counting doors. First door, a stateroom, bed unmade. A woman's silk robe thrown across it. That was decidedly not Charlotte's size. I filed that away for later. Second door on the left, the head. I opened it, ran the sink, and closed it again from the outside. The third door, Reggie's office, was directly across the corridor. I had 90 seconds, maybe 120, before he came looking. The door was not locked. Of course it was not locked. Reggie believed I was a confused old man who could not tell starboard from port. And he believed his wife had married a king. Men like Reggie did not lock doors on their own yachts. The office was small, a built-in desk, a single monitor, a leather chair bolted to the deck, and a framed photograph of Reggie shaking hands with a man I recognized from the financial pages as Marcus Halloran, founder of Coastal Equity Loans, a private lending firm out of Providence that had been investigated twice by the Rhode Island Attorney General for predatory practices against elderly borrowers. I sat down at the desk. The monitor was asleep. I tapped the space bar, and a login screen appeared. The username field was already populated. R. Vandermeer. The cursor blinked in the password field. Eloise's note had said only, "They have a syringe." But 3 weeks ago, when I had called her on the prepaid phone, Edgar had mailed her inside a paperback copy of Treasure Island. My granddaughter had told me something else. "Grandpa, his password for everything is Tesla. Capital T. 2020! Exclamation mark. He thinks it's clever because he leased a Tesla in 2020 and then returned it." I typed Tesla 2020 into the password field. The screen unlocked. His email client opened first. Already logged in. I clicked the search bar and typed Coastal Equity. 47 results appeared. The most recent was dated Tuesday, 3 days ago. From Marcus Halloran. Coastal Equity Loans. 2. Reginald Vandermeer. Subject. Bridge financing. Final reminder. Reginald. This is the third notice. The 2 Wime Point F3 Vimilia Nolar note on the Aurora Borealis matures Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. Without the guardianship paperwork executed and the Whitlock Trust assets pledged as collateral by close of business Monday, we will be forced to file for vessel seizure Tuesday morning. There will be no further extensions. Marcus. I read it twice. Then a third time, slower, to make sure the brass compass against my ribs caught every word as I whispered it aloud. Monday at 5 p.m. The same Monday as the guardianship hearing at 9 a.m. The same Monday Edgar had told me about at dawn. I scrolled down. Beneath the email, attached as a PDF, was a document titled Whitlock Trust Asset Pledge Agreement Draft. I opened it. My name was at the top. The signature line at the bottom was already filled in a signature that looked very much like mine, but was not mine. Then, from the corridor behind me, I heard Reggie's footsteps stop outside the office door. The footsteps stopped. For 3 full seconds, the only sound in Reggie's office was the soft electrical hum of the monitor and the wet, steady thump of my own pulse against the inside of my ribs. I did not move. I did not breathe. My right hand hovered an inch above the keyboard, frozen in the exact position of a man who knows that any motion will betray him. Then the footsteps continued. Past the office door. Past the head. Back toward the salon. I heard Reggie call out, "Pop? You all right in there? You fall asleep on the toilet?" His laugh trailed behind him like exhaust smoke. I exhaled slowly. Through my nose, the way my old chief engineer Tomasz had taught me to do during pressure drops in the engine room. Panic, Tomasz used to say, costs more oxygen than the work itself. I had perhaps 4 minutes left. Maybe 5 if Reggie poured himself a second Macallan before checking on me. I reached into my breast pocket and withdrew the brass compass. With my thumb, I rotated the outer bezel, 3 clicks counterclockwise, a motion that looked, to any observer, like an old captain, fidgeting with a keepsake. In reality, it activated the pinhole camera embedded in the compass's north face crystal. Edgar's specialist in Cambridge had walked me through the function twice, 6 photographs per minute. Internal storage for 400 frames. Encrypted upload via cellular relay the moment the device came within range of the prepaid phone in my coat lining. I held the compass over the monitor and pressed the bezel inward. 1 click. 2. 3. The Coastal Equity email. The forged asset pledge agreement. My fake signature. Marcus Halloran's contact information. The Monday 5 p.m. deadline. Then I scrolled. I needed more than one email. I needed the architecture of the entire scheme. I clicked back to Reggie's inbox and searched the keyword, operation. A folder appeared in the left sidebar. Plain text. No icon. No flourish. Just 3 words. Operation Lighthouse Planning. The audacity of it. The pure, breathtaking audacity. They had named their plot to destroy me after the very structure my late wife and I had been married beneath. They had named it after my home. I clicked the folder. 41 documents, spreadsheets, PDFs, scanned forms. A subfolder labeled medical, another labeled legal, a third labeled contingency. I started with legal. The first document was the guardianship petition itself, the same one Edgar had read aloud to me at dawn. But here, attached to its metadata, was the name of its author. Not Charlotte. Not Reggie. Drafted by Dr. Aldous Pemberton himself, on a workstation registered to St. Cecilia's Maritime Veterans Psychiatric Hospital. The doctor had not been retained as an evaluator. He had been the architect. I photographed it. The second document was a contract 3 pages, signed in blue ink between Reginald Vandermeer and St. Cecilia's. A flat payment of $120,000 upon Nathaniel Whitlock's involuntary admission, a second payment of $250,000 upon the 90-day commitment milestone, a bonus structure for extended care beyond 180 days. They were not putting me away. They were selling me. By the day. I photographed every page. I clicked the medical subfolder. Dr. Pemberton's affidavit. Pre-signed. Pre-dated for Monday. A prescription log for midazolam. 3 milliliters. Refilled 4 times in 6 weeks under Reginald's name. A pharmacy receipt from a CVS in Pawtucket 60 miles from Newport, far enough that no one would notice a pattern. I photographed everything. Then I opened contingency. The folder contained 2 files. The first was a life insurance policy. American Maritime Mutual. Policyholder. Nathaniel Edward Whitlock. Face value. $5 million. Issue date. 11 months ago. Most recent rider increased coverage from $2 million to $5 million, filed 63 days ago. Premiums paid in full by Reginald Vandermeer. The primary beneficiary line read, Charlotte W. Vandermeer, 50%. The secondary beneficiary line read, Reginald T. Vandermeer, 30%. The tertiary beneficiary line read Sienna Marchetti, 20%. Sienna Marchetti. I had never heard the name in my life. 20% of $5 million was $1 million. Someone named Sienna Marchetti, a person who was not my daughter and not my son-in-law, stood to inherit $1 million upon my death. I thought of the silk robe in the unmade stateroom too small for Charlotte. The wrong shade of green for her closet. I thought of Reggie's phone, which Eloise had once told me he kept face down on every dinner table. I photographed the policy. The second file in contingency was a text message thread. Exported as a PDF. Charlotte's name at the top. Reggie's at the bottom. Dated 6 nights ago. Charlotte. What if Pemberton can't get the affidavit through? Reggie. He will. Charlotte. But what if he doesn't? Reggie. Then we use the cliff option. Charlotte. Don't say that. Reggie. It's a cliff. He's an old man. Old men fall off cliffs. Margaret's anniversary. Grieving widower. Last walk at sunset. The medical examiner writes, accident. Done. Charlotte. Stop. Please. Just get Pemberton to do his job. Reggie. I'm just saying we have options. I read it 3 times. My daughter, my Charlotte, who I had taught to swim in Casco Bay when she was 4 years old, who I had walked down the aisle in a lighthouse 7 years ago, had not refused. She had said, don't say that. She had said, stop. But she had not refused. She had not picked up a phone. She had not called a lawyer. She had not warned her father. She had simply asked him to please get Pemberton to do his job. Something inside my chest. Something that had been hairlinea cracked since Margaret's funeral, and held together with willpower and salt air, finally gave way. Not loudly. Not with a sob. Just a small internal sound, like a hull plate finally surrendering its weld after years of fatigue. I photographed the message thread. Then I closed the folder, cleared the search bar, locked the screen, and slipped the compass back into my breast pocket. I stood up, took one slow, steadying breath, and turned toward the office door. I had everything I needed. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard a sound that should not have been there, the unmistakable click of a stateroom door opening down the corridor, and a woman's voice, low and irritated, saying, Reggie, baby, how much longer is the old man going to be here? The voice was not Charlotte's. I pressed my ear against the office door and listened. The woman's voice had drifted somewhere toward the galley, perhaps, or back into the stateroom. I could no longer hear her, but I could hear Reggie. He was in the salon, humming, actually humming. A man who had, 6 nights ago, typed the sentence, old men fall off cliffs, into a text message to his wife, was now humming a Frank Sinatra tune while he poured scotch for the father-in-law he intended to murder. I cracked the office door 3 inches. The corridor was empty. I slipped out, pulled the door shut behind me with the soft click of a man who had spent 50 years closing wheelhouse hatches without waking sleeping crew, and shuffled back toward the salon. By the time I reached the threshold, I had restored the drag in my left foot, the slight stoop in my shoulders, and the unfocused softness around my eyes. There he is, Reggie said brightly, turning from the bar with 2 crystal tumblers in his hands. Thought I lost you, Pop. Everything come out all right? Plumbing's complicated at my age, Reginald. I gave him the small, embarrassed smile of a man losing dignity by inches. But the boat is lovely. Just lovely. Sit. Sit. He gestured to the cream leather sofa. I poured us the good stuff. Macallan 18. Same as Mom liked. I lowered myself onto the sofa with the careful, 2-handed descent of a man whose knees no longer trusted him. Reggie set both tumblers on the low teak table between us. He sat across from me in a matching armchair, crossed his legs, and lifted his own glass with the easy confidence of a man who had already won. But I had watched him pour. I had watched him through the reflection in the framed nautical chart of Narragansett Bay, the same chart that hung slightly crooked above the navigation console. The chart's glass was old, faintly silvered, and at the precise angle I had chosen on the sofa, it returned to me, a perfect mirror of the bar. I had watched Reggie's left hand slip into his jacket pocket. I had watched him withdraw a small glass vial, no longer than my thumb. I had watched him uncap it with the same hand, pour its contents into the tumbler on the right, and return the empty vial to his pocket before lifting both glasses and turning toward me with a smile. The tumbler on the right was now sitting 6 inches in front of me. To Margaret, Reggie said, raising his glass. 50 years. To Margaret, I murmured. I lifted my glass. I did not drink. Go on, Pop. Doctor's orders said one drink is fine. Won't interact with your medications. I had no medications. Dr. Pemberton had invented them, but I let the comment pass and brought the glass to my lips, and at that exact moment, behind Reggie, I heard the sound I had been praying for since I sat down. A child's footsteps on teak. Daddy? Eloise's voice, deliberately too loud, deliberately too close. Daddy, Mom said you have to come look at the thing in the kitchen. The fridge thing, she said now. Reggie's head snapped around. What thing? What are you talking about? The fridge thing. She said it's leaking. She said now, Daddy. It was the second time in 2 hours that my 16-year-old granddaughter had saved my life with 5 words. Reggie set his glass down on the teak table, set it down beside mine, 4 inches apart. Identical crystal, identical color, and stood up with a grunt of irritation. I'll be right back, Pop. Don't drink without me. Old man's toast, all right? Of course, Reginald. He turned and walked out of the salon. The instant his shoulders cleared the doorway, Eloise's eyes locked onto mine. She did not speak. She did not need to. She simply pointed one quick, sharp gesture at the 2 glasses on the table. I swapped them. Right glass to my side of the table. Left glass to Reggie's. The motion took less than a second. Eloise was already gone, padding down the corridor toward the galley, her bare feet making a small, hurried sound against the wood. When Reggie returned 30 seconds later, scowling, muttering that there was nothing wrong with the refrigerator and that Charlotte had no idea what she was talking about, he picked up the glass on his side of the table without looking at it and drank. He drank deeply. A grown man's pour of scotch, dosed for an old man's body weight. To Margaret, he said again, settling back into his armchair. And to family, Pop. To family. To family. I touched my lips to my own glass, to the clean glass, and let a single drop of Macallan touch my tongue. It tasted the way Margaret used to say it should. Honey and oak and a faraway peat fire on a Scottish cliff. It took 18 minutes. I counted them on the bulkhead clock above Reggie's shoulder. At minute 6, his sentences began to lengthen and lose their endings. At minute 11, he laughed at a joke I had not made. At minute 14, he called me Captain instead of Pop the first time in 12 years. At minute 18, he leaned forward, eyes glassy and warm, and said, Captain, can I tell you something? Man to man? I never wanted any of this. The big idea, the lighthouse thing that was Charlotte. I told her. I said, Baby, your old man is sharper than a tack. He's going to see it coming. But she said no. She said you'd been slipping. She said you forgot her birthday 2 years running. I had not forgotten Charlotte's birthday. I had mailed her a card and a check for $1,000 on her birthday for 38 consecutive years, including the last 2. Edgar kept the carbon receipts in a folder. And Sienna? I asked very softly. What about Sienna? Reggie's smile widened, drugged, and proud. Sienna's the smart one, he said. Sienna's the one who figured out the policy. Sienna's? He stopped. His glassy eyes blinked twice, slowly, as if he had just heard the name he had spoken and could not place where the sound had come from. Behind him, in the salon doorway, a woman in a green silk robe had appeared. Her face was very pale. Reggie, she said. What did you just say? The green silk robe was the wrong shade for a woman with red hair. That was the first thing I noticed. The engineer's habit of cataloging mismatches, of seeing the seam that did not align. Sienna Marchetti was perhaps 35, perhaps 40, with the kind of expensively maintained beauty that required 3 appointments a week, and a man with another woman's money. Her hair was the dark copper of old pennies. The robe was emerald. Margaret would have called the combination a sin against the color wheel. Margaret had been ruthless about such things. Sienna's eyes went from Reggie's slack, drugged face to my own carefully arranged confusion. She took one step into the salon. Her bare feet made no sound on the teak. Reggie, she said again, more sharply this time. What did you just say to him? Reggie blinked at her. His mouth opened. Nothing intelligent came out. Sienna, honey? I said, leaning forward in the gentle, baffled way of a man trying to place a stranger at his grandson's christening. Are you a friend of Charlotte's? I'm afraid Reginald didn't introduce us. She stared at me. For 3 full seconds, she stared. Her gaze traveled across my face the way a customs officer inspects a passport photograph, checking the brow, the jaw, the eyes, and I understood, with the cold clarity of cold water, that she had been shown a picture of me before. Recently, and the picture she had been shown was not of a confused old man. Where's Charlotte? She said, not taking her eyes off me. In the kitchen, I believe. Fixing the refrigerator. Sienna's head turned a fraction, and at that exact moment, Charlotte herself appeared in the doorway behind her, wiping her hands on a cream linen towel. My daughter's eyes registered Sienna's presence in the salon, in the robe, in front of her father, in 3 escalating jolts: surprise, fury, and finally, terror. Sienna. Charlotte's voice was very quiet. What are you doing out here? Your husband just said my name in front of him. Sienna jerked her chin at me without breaking eye contact. And he said it like he knew who I was. Reggie. Charlotte crossed the salon in 4 strides and crouched beside her husband's armchair. She put a hand on his cheek. His head lolled. His pupils were the size of dinner plates. Reggie, what did you drink? How much did you drink? 1 glass, Reggie slurred. 1 little glass. Pop still got his. Look at Pop. Pop didn't drink his. He turned his glassy eyes toward me. And for 1 terrible second I saw something flicker behind them. Not quite suspicion, but the beginning of the question that, if asked, would end everything. Why didn't you drink yours, Captain? I lifted my untouched tumbler with a hand I made shake just enough. I was waiting for the toast, Reginald. You said a toast. I didn't want to be rude. Charlotte was already lifting Reggie's glass to her nose. She sniffed it. Her face did not change, but the linen towel in her other hand tightened to a white knot around her knuckles. He drank the wrong glass, she said very softly to Sienna. How? Sienna hissed. I don't know how. Charlotte. He's slurring. He's saying names. I know. How long? 20 minutes? 30? Sienna turned to me again, and this time her face had rearranged itself into something I had seen before. On the bridges of cargo ships when a captain realizes a containment has been breached. It was the face of a person doing arithmetic she did not want to do. He's not senile, she said. Charlotte stood up slowly. Sienna. Charlotte. Look at him. Look at his hands. Look at how he's holding that glass. Senile men don't hold glasses like that. Senile men spill. I tightened my fingers fractionally on the crystal, not enough to be obvious, but enough to telegraph control. It was a deliberate slip. I needed her to look at me, fully, for 1 moment longer. I needed her angle. I needed her to step into the salon and away from the corridor. Because the corridor was the only way back to the office. And the office was where Reggie's monitor still held, in its Resenta documents cache, every file I had photographed. Sienna stepped into the salon. My left hand, hidden by the angle of the sofa arm, found the brass compass in my breast pocket. I rotated the outer bezel 5 clicks clockwise. The motion was small. The motion was silent. The motion sent a 1500 megahertz emergency burst to a Coast Guard relay tower at Beavertail Point, 6 nautical miles to the southwest, which would forward the signal within 30 seconds to Station Castle Hill, where a young petty officer named Diaz had been briefed at dawn by Edgar Pemberton's office to expect exactly this transmission from exactly this vessel. I waited for the confirmation tone. A single haptic pulse against my ribs. 2 pulses meant signal received and acknowledged. 3 pulses meant Coast Guard underway. I felt nothing. I rotated the bezel 5 clicks clockwise again. Nothing. Sienna was speaking fast, low, urgent, and Charlotte was answering her in fragments. And Reggie was sliding sideways in the armchair like a marionette whose strings had been cut. and somewhere in the back of my mind a calm, methodical engineer's voice was saying the antenna is shielded. You are below the waterline. The bulkhead is steel. The signal is not penetrating. I needed topside. I needed the open deck. I needed sky. I'd like to step outside, I said, rising slowly. For some air. The cabin is warm. No. Sienna's voice cut across the salon. Charlotte? He doesn't go anywhere alone. Sienna. Charlotte. The cliff is 200 yards from this slip. If he's faking, he runs. If he's not faking, he falls. Either way, we lose. It was the first time I heard the cliff option spoken aloud by a woman whose name had not existed in my world 4 hours ago, in a tone as casual as a weather report. And then through the porthole behind Sienna's shoulder, the marina's lights along Pier 14 began to flicker. Once. Twice. 3 times. From somewhere across the harbor, a foghorn sounded 3 short blasts. Then 3 more. Then 3 more again. 3 short blasts. Repeated. The international maritime signal for vessel in distress. All hands stand by. Sienna spun toward the porthole. Charlotte's linen towel dropped to the teak floor, and from the far end of the corridor, Eloise screamed. Eloise's scream was not a child's scream. I had heard a child's scream before the high, ragged sound Charlotte had made at 6 years old when a wave knocked her off the dock at Casco Bay. That scream had been involuntary, animal, broken. This was different. This scream had shape. This scream had rhythm. This scream was 3 sharp bursts, ah, 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 and then a pause, and then 3 more, and I understood with a flood of pride, so sudden it made my eyes wet, that my 16-year-old granddaughter was sending Morse code with her voice. 3 short. The letter S. The international distress signal. The same pattern I had taught her on the deck of the Margaret Ann when she was 11 years old, and asked me what a sailor would do if he had no radio. Sienna spun toward the corridor. Shut her up. Shut her up. Charlotte did not move. She was staring through the porthole at the marina lights, which were no longer flickering randomly. They were now flickering in deliberate sequence, long, short, and a man whose entire adult life had been organized around running lights and signal codes did not need 3 guesses to know what was happening on the water outside. The Coast Guard was rounding Beavertail Point. A horn sounded closer this time, deeper. The throat of a 47-foot motor lifeboat. Then a second horn, higher pitched, a Defender-class response boat, the kind Station Castle Hill kept tied at the inner pier for exactly these operations. White running lights bloomed against the porthole glass like a sunrise arriving from the wrong direction. Sienna saw them. Her entire face emptied. Charlotte, she said. Charlotte, we need to go. Now. Charlotte did not look at her. Charlotte was looking at me, and for the first time since I had stepped off the ferry at Pier 14 4 hours ago, my daughter was looking at me the way she had looked at me when she was 9 years old and had broken a Waterford vase that had belonged to her grandmother. Caught. Ruined, and beyond all available lies. Daddy, she said. It was the second time she had called me that in one day. The first time, on the pier, had been theater. This time was not. I rose from the sofa. I did not shuffle. I did not stoop. I did not drag my left foot. I rose the way I had risen from 1,000 wardroom chairs over 50 years at sea, squarely, on 2 strong knees, with my shoulders pulled back beneath the old wool of a coat I had bought the year my company first cleared $1 million in revenue. Charlotte made a small sound in her throat. You're not, she began. I am exactly what I have always been, Charlotte. I am your father. And I am not, and have never been, senile. Above us, on the open deck, boots landed on teak. There were 4 of them. I learned their names within the hour. Petty Officer Maria Diaz of Coast Guard Station Castle Hill. In her dark blue working uniform, sidearm holstered, badge clipped to her chest. Special Agent Thomas Reyes of the FBI's Providence Field Office, in a windbreaker stenciled with 3 yellow letters. A federal magistrate's clerk named Hollings, carrying a sealed warrant in a black document folder. And, walking 3 paces behind them with a leather briefcase pressed against his chest and white hair lifting in the harbor wind. Edgar Pemberton, my lawyer of 38 years. My friend of 40, the man whose voice had pulled me back from a ferry I should never have boarded. Edgar saw me through the salon doorway and let out a breath so loud I heard it across the deck. "Captain Whitlock," Petty Officer Diaz said, stepping into the salon. Her eyes scanned the room in one professional sweep, Reggie unconscious in the armchair, Charlotte frozen at the navigation console, Sienna already turning toward the aft hatch. "Sir, are you in any medical distress?" "None whatsoever, officer. Did you transmit an emergency signal from this vessel within the last 45 minutes? "I attempted to, twice. From below the waterline. Steel bulkhead interference." She almost smiled. "Your granddaughter transmitted for you, sir." Vocally. From the aft galley window. We had eyes on her from the cutter the moment she opened it. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Just one. Behind Diaz, Sienna had reached the aft hatch. She got it open. She got 1 foot onto the swim platform. She got no further. A second Coast Guard officer, a young man I never learned the name of, was already standing on the dock, and he caught Sienna around the upper arm with the firm, unhurried grip of a man who had practiced the motion in training 100 times. "Ma'am," he said politely, "please step back aboard." Special Agent Reyes was already reading from the warrant. His voice filled the salon with the flat, ceremonial cadence of federal authority. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping under color of medical authority. Conspiracy to commit murder. Solicitation of homicide. Forgery of federal trust instruments. Wire fraud. Insurance fraud. Each charge landed in the air between my daughter and me, like a stone dropped into still water. Charlotte sank to the deck. She did not faint. She simply lowered herself, knee by knee, until she was kneeling beside her husband's armchair, with her hands pressed against her face. Edgar crossed the salon and stood at my shoulder. He did not speak. He simply opened his briefcase, withdrew a single sheet of paper, the motion to dismiss the guardianship petition, signed and notarized at 6:45 that morning by a Rhode Island Superior Court judge whose son had served 2 years aboard one of my company's research vessels, and handed it to Diaz. Outside, at the Vandermeer estate in Newport, a separate FBI team was at that same moment arresting Dr. Aldous Pemberton in the front parlor, where he had been waiting with a pre-signed affidavit and a black leather syringe case. Eloise appeared in the salon doorway. Her cheeks were wet. Her hands were shaking. She did not look at her mother. She walked straight across the teak, past Sienna, past Reggie, past Charlotte on her knees, and pressed her forehead against my chest. "Grandpa," she whispered, "did I do it right?" "You did it right, sweetheart. You did it perfectly." I held her for what may have been 30 seconds. It may have been 3 minutes. I did not check the bulkhead clock. When I lifted my head, a black Cadillac SUV had pulled onto Pier 14 with its headlights still on. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was 74 years old, wore a charcoal overcoat I recognized from a winter in 2003, and had not stood on the same dock as me since Margaret had made me promise, on her hospital bed, that I would never speak his name aloud again. He saw me through the porthole. He raised one hand. The man who stepped out of the Cadillac walked like our father. That was the thing I had forgotten in 22 years. The specific gait of the Whitlock men, the slight outward roll of the left foot that our father had passed to both his sons, the way other fathers pass down pocket watches. I watched Jonathan cross Pier 14 toward the Aurora Borealis with that gait, and the years between us folded for a moment into nothing at all. He was 4 years younger than me, which made him 70. His hair had gone the color of bleached driftwood. He carried himself the way a man carries himself when he has rehearsed an apology for 2 decades and is finally, at the worst possible hour, getting to deliver it. Petty Officer Diaz appeared at my elbow. "Sir, Do you know that man? I knew him once. Should I keep him off the pier? I watched Jonathan stop at the foot of the gangway. He did not climb it. He did not call out. He simply set his briefcase down on the planking, removed his hat, and waited, like a man presenting himself for inspection. No, officer. Let him stand there. Let him stand there as long as he needs to. Diaz nodded once and turned her attention back to the salon, where Special Agent Reyes was reading Charlotte her rights in a voice that did not rise above a recitation of the weather. I heard the soft metallic click of handcuffs. I did not turn around to watch. I walked down the gangway alone. The harbor wind had risen. It pulled at the hem of my captain's coat the way it had pulled at it on 100 docks across 40 years of working sea. Jonathan watched me come. When I reached the bottom of the gangway and stepped onto the pier, he held out his hand. He did not say my name. He did not say anything at all. I took his hand. We shook once. His grip was steadier than I expected. He let go. "Margaret," he said, finally. His voice had not changed the same low, careful timbre our mother had once described as a Presbyterian preacher reading from the back of a feed sack. "I broke a promise to come here, Nathaniel. I know what that means. What are you doing on this pier, Jonathan?" "I'm the one who called Edgar 6 weeks ago." The harbor went very quiet. "I have been watching Charlotte's account since the spring of 2022, he continued. Eyes on mine, not blinking. I never closed the bank contacts I built when I was at the Department of Justice. When she started moving money to Coastal Equity in March, I flagged it. When she started corresponding with Aldous Pemberton in August, I forwarded the metadata to Edgar through a cutout in Boston. Edgar didn't know it was me. Until last Tuesday, I let his words settle. I had spent the morning being lied to by people who shared my last name. I had spent the afternoon being lied to by people who shared my dinner table. I had earned, by sundown, a certain calibration for the truth. Jonathan was telling the truth. "Why?" I asked. "Because Margaret was wrong about me, Nathaniel. And because you were wrong about me. And because, after 22 years of being wrong about each other, somebody in this family needed to be right about something." I did not answer. He picked up his briefcase and stepped back, leaving the pier open between us. He did not press. He did not push. He simply turned and walked back toward the Cadillac, and at the door he paused with his hand on the handle and said, over his shoulder, "I'll be at the Hyatt on Goat Island. Room 411, as long as you need." Then he got in the car. The Cadillac pulled away. I stood on the pier alone for a long time. Long enough that Diaz eventually came down the gangway to find me. She did not ask what had been said. She asked, instead, the question I had been waiting 50 years for someone in an official uniform to ask. "Captain Whitlock, would you mind coming aboard the cutter? We need a full statement. And sir, we need to know exactly who you are." I almost laughed. It would have been the first laugh of the day. The cutter's wardroom was small, fluorescent, smelled of coffee and steel polish. Diaz sat across from me with a department-issue tablet and a recording device that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. I gave her my name, Nathaniel Edward Whitlock, born March 3, 1954, Portland, Maine. I gave her my Coast Guard Reserve Commission number from 1981. I gave her the Federal Employer Identification Number of Whitlock Maritime Technologies, Limited Liability Company, incorporated in Delaware in 1985. Registered agent in Wilmington. Principal place of business, at 14 Lighthouse Point Road, Portland. Diaz's stylus stopped moving. "Sir," she said carefully. "Whitlock Maritime Technologies. The Whitlock Maritime Technologies has been listed in trade publications for 20 years as having an undisclosed principal." "That's correct, officer. You are the undisclosed principal." "I am." She set the stylus down. 17 patents, she said quietly, including the hollow stress monitoring system on the Defender-class boat that brought me here tonight. Patent number 6. 492-881. Filed 1997. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up the stylus and resumed writing. And I understood that I had just done a thing I had spent 40 years avoiding. I had told the truth about myself, in a room with a recording device, to a federal officer who would file the document in a system that would be searchable by any reporter with a press card and a question. By morning, my name would not be my own anymore. We worked through the statement for 90 minutes. When Diaz finally closed the tablet, she walked me back up to the deck of the cutter. The Aurora Borealis was lit now from stem to stern by Coast Guard floodlights. Sienna was already gone, transferred to a federal vehicle on the upper pier. Reggie had been moved to an ambulance for medical clearance. Dr. Pemberton, Reyes informed me by radio, was in custody at the Providence field office. Charlotte was being walked down the gangway in handcuffs. She saw me on the cutter's deck. She stopped. The federal officer holding her elbow waited. She did not call me Daddy. She did not apologize. She looked at me across 30 feet of Black Harbor water, and she said, very clearly, loud enough for Reyes and Diaz, and Edgar and Eloise on the pier to hear, "It wasn't me, Daddy. It wasn't Sienna. Ask Reggie about Annalise." 3 days after the Coast Guard floodlights had turned the Aurora Borealis into a stage, I sat at a walnut conference table on the 16th floor of the United States Attorney's Office in Providence and watched a man I had once trusted enough to call my son-in-law tell the truth for the first time in his adult life. Reggie had been cleaned up. His hair was combed. He wore a borrowed gray suit that did not fit him at the shoulders, and the cuffs of his shirt were 2 sizes too long, which gave his hands the appearance of disappearing every time he gestured. The drugs were out of his system. The bravado was gone with them. Across the table, Special Agent Reyes sat with a folder open in front of him. Beside Reyes sat an assistant United States attorney named Priya Achterberg, who had the calm, unhurried demeanor of a woman who had broken stronger men than Reginald Vandermeer before breakfast. Edgar sat at my right shoulder. Jonathan, at my insistence, sat at my left. "Mr. Vandermeer," Achterberg said, "for the record, whose idea was Operation Lighthouse?" Reggie did not look at me. He looked at the wood grain of the table. "Annalise Marchetti," he said. The name landed with the small, definite weight of a key turning in a lock. "Annalise is Sienna's older sister," Reggie continued. "She's a private equity attorney at Crandall and Vance in Manhattan. She handled a real estate matter for me in 2020 OU. Sienna and I started, last year, and one weekend at Annalise's place in the Hamptons. She sat us down and said she had been doing some research." "What research, Mr. Vandermeer?" "She'd seen a leaked filing. Some swide cheesy paperwork from a settlement at Whitlock Maritime Technologies. The royalty stream had a name on it. Not Pop's name, a trust name, but Annalise ran the trust through some public records and figured out it was Nathaniel Whitlock, my father-in-law, the senile old captain who couldn't work a smartphone." I did not move my face. "She had it all worked out in 6 pages, Reggie said. Step 1, isolate. Step 2, declare. Step 3, pledge. Step 4, contingency. She wrote the whole thing on her dining room table over 2 bottles of Brunello. Achterberg slid a single sheet across the table. "Is this the document, Mr. Vandermeer?" Reggie looked at it. His face folded. "Yes. For the record, please confirm the date in the metadata. June 14th, 2024. 11 months ago." "Yes." Edgar laid his own folder on the table calmly, the way a carpenter lays down a level, and began to walk Achterberg and Reyes through the evidence the brass compass had photographed in 4 minutes on the Aurora Borealis. The Coastal Equity email with its 5 p.m. Monday deadline. The forged Whitlock Trust asset pledge agreement with my signature in someone else's hand. The St. Cecilia's contract with its 100 with 1,000 20,000 entry fee. The pre-signed Pemberton affidavit. The CVS Pawtucket midazolam log. The $5 million life insurance rider with Sienna Marchetti as 20% beneficiary. The Cliff Option text thread. Each document landed on the table with a small, clean sound. Each sound was a wall going up around a person who had once been my daughter. Jonathan added his own contribution last. A 6-week metadata trail. Wire transfers between Charlotte's joint account at First Providence and a holding company in Delaware that Edgar's office had now traced, that morning, to Annalise Marchetti's signature authority. Reyes closed his folder. "Mr. Vandermeer," he said, "your sister-in-law will be arrested in Manhattan tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Eastern. Your wife's defense team has been notified. Your own plea agreement, as discussed, will be entered before Judge Holcomb at 2 p.m. on Friday." Reggie nodded once. He did not speak. There was, perhaps, nothing left in him to say. Sienna's interview had taken place the previous afternoon, in a smaller room 2 floors below us. She had flipped on her older sister within 40 minutes. The Marchetti women, it turned out, had a long history of one of them spending money the other had not yet earned, and Sienna, facing 15 years on conspiracy and insurance fraud, had decided that whatever sisterly loyalty existed between her and Annalise did not survive a federal sentencing chart. Annalise Marchetti was arrested at 6:12 the next morning, in the lobby of a glass building on 6th Avenue, by 2 FUAFI agents whose names I never learned. She was wearing a cream cashmere coat and was on her way to a yoga class on the 14th floor. The arrest made the New York Post by 10 a.m. It made the front page of the Boston Globe by noon. By noon, a great deal of other things had also happened. My name, the name I had spent 40 years keeping out of trade publications and shareholder filings, had appeared in print beside the words $14 million, 17 patents, and anonymous founder. My phone, which Edgar had been guarding since Saturday night, held 41 voicemails from journalists, 3 from television producers, 1 from a man who claimed to represent a streaming service. I returned none of them. I would, eventually, return one. But not that day. Late that afternoon, after Reggie had been escorted out and Achterberg had thanked us, and the conference room had emptied of all officials except Reyes, Edgar leaned across the walnut table and said, very quietly, "Nathaniel, there is one more thing." He slid a manila envelope toward me. "Charlotte's defense team filed this at 11 this morning. It is a motion citing emotional duress. They are arguing that her participation in Operation Lighthouse was the product of long-term psychological coercion." "By whom?" Edgar did not answer immediately. He looked, instead, at Jonathan. Jonathan looked back at him with the calm of a man who had been expecting this exact moment for a long time. "The motion," Edgar said, "includes a sealed exhibit. A letter. Dated April 2nd, 2017. From whom?" "From Margaret." The room went very still. The fluorescent hum of the ceiling lights became, for one moment, the loudest sound in the building. "Margaret died in October of 2017. I said. "Yes. 6 months after that letter, yes. And the letter is being introduced in evidence against me." "It is being introduced," Edgar said carefully, in support of Charlotte, "by her counsel, with a request that you, as the addressee, voluntarily unseal it before trial." I looked at the envelope on the walnut table. I did not pick it up. Outside the conference room window, the afternoon sun had begun its slow walk across the bay. The morning Eloise came to my house in Portland. The harbor was the color of pewter, and the wind off Casco Bay smelled the way it had smelled the day I brought Margaret home from the hospital in 1978, holding a 3-day-old Charlotte in a yellow blanket and trying to remember every single thing the nurse had told me about formula temperatures. I had not slept. Margaret's letter sat on the kitchen table in its manila envelope, still sealed, still untouched. I had carried it home from Providence the previous afternoon and set it down beside the salt shaker, and I had walked past it 9 times before sunrise without once reaching for it. I did not yet have the strength. I knew that about myself the way a captain knows the limits of his own vessel in a following sea. Eloise arrived at 8 in the morning with a court-appointed guardian named Mrs. Faraday, who wore a knitted cardigan and the patient expression of a woman who had walked into 100 broken houses in her career and had learned not to flinch at any of them. Mrs. Faraday stayed exactly 12 minutes, long enough to introduce herself, long enough to confirm that the parlor was warm, and that I had food in the refrigerator, and that there was a working telephone within reach. And then she stepped out onto my front porch and told me, very kindly, that she would wait in her car for as long as the conversation needed. I made Eloise a cup of cocoa, the same way Margaret had made it for Charlotte at the same age, whole milk warmed in a small saucepan, a square of bittersweet chocolate stirred in by hand, a single marshmallow at the end. Eloise watched me make it without speaking. When I set the mug in front of her at the parlor table, she wrapped both hands around it and held it without drinking. "Grandpa," she said finally. "Mrs. Faraday said I have to choose." "I know, sweetheart." She said, "There are 3 places. The Vandermeers in Connecticut. You, here. Or Great Uncle Jonathan in Boston." "That's right. I don't know any of you, really. I mean, I know you, but I don't know the way kids are supposed to know their grandfathers. I saw you 9 times in my whole life. I saw Great Uncle Jonathan twice. At funerals." I sat down across from her. I did not reach for her hand. I did not crowd the moment. She was 16 years old, and she had, in the last 72 hours, transmitted a coded distress signal from a yacht owned by a man who intended to murder me. And she deserved to be treated as the small, exhausted adult she had been forced to become. "Eloise," I said, "whatever you choose, I will support. If you go to your father's parents, I will visit on every holiday, and every birthday, and every Tuesday you'll let me. If you come here, you will have your own bedroom and your own desk and whatever else a 16-year-old needs that I am not yet wise enough to anticipate. If you go to Jonathan, the same. There is no choice on that list that disappoints me." She nodded. She still did not drink the cocoa. "Grandpa, can I ask you something? Anything. Why didn't you ever talk to Great Uncle Jonathan? Mom said he did something terrible, but she never said what." I looked at her for a long moment. The wind shifted outside. The harbor light at the end of my breakwater began its slow, familiar pulse, long, short, long, the same signature it had been broadcasting for 43 years. "In 2003, I said, your great-grandmother was sick. My mother. She lived in a small house in Bath, and she was dying of pancreatic cancer. And she signed a will, 6 weeks before she died, that left her house, and what little she had to Jonathan, and to me, equally. After she died, Jonathan filed a probate motion in Maine Superior Court, arguing that I had used undue influence to convince her to include me at all. He had documents, bank statements, a nurse's affidavit. Margaret read the filings, and she made up her mind that Jonathan had done a wicked thing. And she asked me, on her deathbed 14 years later, to never speak his name in our home again. Did he do a wicked thing? Eloise. I don't know. Jonathan told me on the pier 3 days ago that he had been wrong about that filing, that he had been told by a lawyer of his own, a man who turned out to be a fraud, that I had pressured our mother, and that he had believed it. And that by the time he learned the truth, Margaret had already drawn the line she drew. I have not yet decided what to do with what he told me. But I am not going to ask you to decide for me, and I am not going to let an old man's grievance become a 16-year-old girl's inheritance. Eloise was quiet for a long time. Then she lifted the cocoa to her mouth and drank. When she set the mug down, she said, I want to come here, Grandpa. I want to come live with you. I felt something move in my chest the way a hull moves the first time it returns to deep water after a long dry dock. Are you certain, sweetheart? I'm certain. You can change your mind. The court will let you change your mind for a long while yet. I know. But I'm not going to. Why? She thought about it. She was the kind of child who thought before she answered. Because when I screamed on the boat, she said, I didn't scream for Mom. I didn't scream for Dad. I screamed in the code you taught me on the Margaret Ann when I was 11, and nobody else in my whole life would even know what that was. I did not trust my voice for several seconds. All right, sweetheart. All right. She drank the rest of her cocoa. Mrs. Faraday came back inside at 9. The paperwork was a single page, and Eloise signed it in blue ink. And Mrs. Faraday signed beside her. And just like that, across the parlor table where Margaret had once read the Sunday paper, my granddaughter became my responsibility for the first time in either of our lives. Eloise went upstairs to look at the bedroom that had once been her mother's. I went into the kitchen and picked up Margaret's letter. I unsealed it at sunset. I unsealed Margaret's letter at 6:42 in the evening, with the last band of orange sun lying flat across the kitchen table, the way she had always preferred it, late, unhurried. The kind of light she had once told me was the only honest light of the day. The envelope had been sealed with a piece of clear tape rather than the gummed flap, which was Margaret's habit when she did not want the paper to yellow at the seam. The handwriting on the front was hers. 3 words. For Nathaniel. Later. The letter itself was 4 pages, written on cream stationery from the small printer in Wiscasset she had used for 30 years. The date in her hand at the top corner was April 2nd, 2017, 6 months and 11 days before she died. I read it once at the table. Then I stood up, walked to the parlor, sat in the wingback chair that had been her chair, and read it again. In the spring of 2014, Margaret wrote, she had discovered that Charlotte had been quietly removing money from the operating account of a small literacy charity. Margaret administered in Portland a thing called the Casco Bay Readers Fund, which Margaret had founded in 1996 and which served about 300 children a year through a network of volunteer tutors. The total, Margaret wrote, had come to $41,200 over a period of approximately 3 years. The withdrawals had been small. They had been disguised as reimbursements for fundraising expenses Charlotte had not actually incurred. The board had never noticed. Margaret had noticed only because she had taken over the bookkeeping herself after the longtime treasurer's husband had become ill. Margaret had not told me. She had not told the board. She had not called the police. She had drawn $41,200 from her own personal savings, a sum she had been quietly accumulating since 1977, a sum she had once told me she was saving for a trip to the Outer Hebrides we never took. And she had replaced every missing dollar in the operating account, line by line, in 3 transfers over the course of a single Tuesday afternoon. Then she had driven to Newport. She had confronted Charlotte at a coffee shop near the Vandermeer house. She had told Charlotte that she knew. She had told Charlotte that no charges would be filed and that Nate would never be told. On the condition that Charlotte enter therapy with a counselor of Margaret's choosing, that Charlotte never accept another position of fiduciary responsibility in any nonprofit anywhere, and that Charlotte spend 200 hours of volunteer work, anonymously, at a women's shelter in Providence over the following 2 years. Charlotte had agreed. Charlotte had complied. The 200 hours had been completed by March of 2016. Margaret had believed it was finished. In the letter, she wrote, Nathaniel, I made a wager with myself, and the wager was that our daughter could be rehabilitated by a mother's silence and a mother's accountability. I believed your disappointment would break her permanently. I believed I could carry the weight of what she had done by myself, and that the weight would not rot. I was wrong about all of it. If you are reading this, then I have failed her in a way I never told you about, and I am asking you, from the other side of whatever comes next, to forgive what neither of us could fix in time. I read the letter 3 times that night. I did not weep. I sat in Margaret's chair with the pages on my knees, and I watched the harbor light at the end of my breakwater make its long, short, long signature against the water for 2 hours. And somewhere in the middle of those 2 hours, I came to understand that my wife had carried a thing alone for 3 years that she should not have carried alone, and that I had been so completely the man she expected me to be, so completely the captain who would have refused to forgive, that she had decided the safer course was to spare me the choice. I did not blame her. By the 2nd hour, I had stopped trying. In the morning, I made 3 decisions. The first was that I would not introduce the letter at trial. Charlotte's defense team had asked for it. Achterberg had warned me, by telephone, that the prosecution would consider it impeaching evidence on the duress motion. Edgar had told me the decision was mine alone. I burned the original in the parlor fireplace at 7:30 in the morning, after photographing each page for my own records, and I called Edgar from the kitchen at 8. "No letter," I said. "Not at trial. Not ever. Tell Achterberg the addressee declines to unseal." Edgar did not argue. He had known me for 38 years. The second decision was that I would buy the yacht. Aurora Borealis was scheduled for federal auction in 12 days, in Newport, as part of the asset forfeiture in Reggie and Sienna's case. Edgar's office filed the qualifying paperwork that afternoon. I instructed the firm to bid up to $2.6 million, $300,000 above the outstanding coastal equity note, and to bid through a blind LLC so that the auction would not become a press event. The third decision was that I would rename her. I drove to Newport on the morning of the auction. I sat in a folding chair in a marshal's office that smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax, and I bid in writing through Edgar's associate, and at 12:14 p.m., the gavel came down at $2.1 million, and the Aurora Borealis became the property of an entity called Margaret's Light, LLC, the formation papers of which I had signed the previous Friday. The clerk handed me a thick folder of title documents. I signed where indicated. I initialed where indicated. I dated where indicated. Then the clerk reached into a separate drawer and withdrew a second envelope, cream, certified, with the kind of green return receipt sticker that meant a postal worker had been trying to deliver it for some weeks. "This came for you at our office, sir. They said they had no current address. It's been sitting here 3 weeks. The envelope was from a law firm in Hartford. The return address read Halpern, Doyle, and Mercer, attorneys at law. I had not heard the name Halpern in 52 years. The last time I had heard it had been in the spring of 1974, on a pier in New London, from a young woman in a yellow raincoat who had told me she was carrying my child. The Halpern letter was 3 paragraphs long, and it took me about as long to read it as it took for the kettle to boil that evening in my kitchen. Iris Halpern had died on February 11th of that year, in a hospice in West Hartford, at the age of 71. On her last lucid afternoon, she had told her only son Daniel, a pediatric cardiologist at Connecticut Children's Hospital, the name of the young Navy officer she had met on a pier in New London in March of 1974, and the name of the child she had not, in the end, been carrying when she came looking for him 3 weeks later. The pregnancy, Iris had told her son, had ended quietly and on its own. But there had been, 4 months after that, another pregnancy, with a man she eventually married. A man Daniel had spent 51 years believing was his biological father. Iris, on her deathbed, had told Daniel she was no longer certain. The letter was not a demand. It was not a claim. It was a careful, professionally worded request for a single voluntary genetic sample, mailed in a kit that Halpern, Doyle, and Mercer would provide, to a laboratory in New Haven. Daniel was not asking for anything else. He had no interest. The letter said, in inheritance, in publicity, or in disturbing my family. He simply wanted, as a physician and as a son, to know who he was. I read the letter at my kitchen table while Eloise did geometry homework in the parlor. I called Edgar in the morning. By the afternoon, Edgar had spoken to Hartford. By the end of the week, a small white box had arrived at my door, and I had swabbed the inside of my cheek twice and sealed the tube and dropped it at the post office in Portland on a Thursday, and I had not yet decided what I felt about any of it. The trial began the second Monday in October. It took 6 weeks. I will not give a full accounting of those weeks, because there are men more qualified than I am to write courtroom narrative, and because most of what happened in the federal courthouse in Providence was, in the end, the slow public reading of documents that Edgar's compass had already photographed in 4 minutes in a yacht office. Asa Achterberg tried the case with the calm, surgical patience of a woman who had brought 100 binders and intended to use every one of them. Reggie pleaded out, as agreed, and received 6 years at a low-security facility in Pennsylvania. Sienna, having flipped on her sister, drew 8. Charlotte, against Edgar's expectations and somewhat against my own, was offered a plea by Ochterberg in week 4, 5 years suspended, conditional on completion of an inpatient program, full restitution of all attorney's fees borne by my estate, and the surrender of her real estate license. Charlotte signed. I did not attend the hearing. Edgar told me afterward that she had wept quietly in the courtroom and had asked, through her counsel, whether I would consider receiving a letter from her at some point in the future. I told Edgar that I would consider it. I did not promise more than that. Anneliese Marchetti went to trial. She did not flinch through 6 weeks of proceedings. She testified on her own behalf, against her counsel's advice, and she lied with the steady, professional grace of a woman who had built a career persuading boards of directors to vote against their own interests. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. The verdict came back guilty on all 11 counts. Judge Holcomb sentenced her, 2 weeks later, to 15 years at a federal facility in Danbury, Connecticut. By the time Annalise was led from the courtroom, my name had appeared in 311 news articles. Whitlock Maritime Technologies had received 17 acquisition inquiries, all of which I declined. The streaming service producer had called 4 more times. I had returned exactly 1 journalist's call, a woman at the Portland Press-Herald named Anya Chowdhury, who had written about Margaret's literacy charity in 2009 and who I had decided, en instant, was the right person to talk to about what I planned to do with the next chapter of my life. Eloise enrolled in homeschooling on a Tuesday in late October. I had hired a retired teacher named Mrs. Vance, 62 years old, who had spent 30 years at Cape Elizabeth High School and who arrived at 14 Lighthouse Point Road at 9 each morning with 2 thermoses of tea and a leather satchel full of books. Eloise took to her quickly. By Thanksgiving, she had begun to laugh again. Small laughs, careful ones, but they were laughs. By Christmas, she had begun to ask whether she could, perhaps, take sailing lessons at the small club at the foot of Munjoy Hill in the spring. On the 4th of December, the genetic results came back from the laboratory in New Haven. Daniel Halpern was my biological son. I drove to Hartford on a Saturday morning, alone, and met him in a diner on Farmington Avenue. He was tall, taller than I had been at his age, and he had Iris's eyes, which I had not expected to remember, but which I recognized the moment he stood up from the booth. We talked for 3 hours. He showed me photographs of his 2 children, who were 6 and 9, and asked me, very carefully, whether I might consider meeting them in the spring. I told him I would. I told him I had a granddaughter who was 16 and who, I suspected, would like very much to know that she had cousins. He cried a little. I did not. I had used up most of my crying earlier in the year. I drove north on Interstate 95 with the late afternoon sun behind me. My phone rang somewhere south of Worcester. It was Jonathan. Nathaniel, he said. I'm at the Hyatt. I need you to come to Newport. There's something at the lighthouse where you and Margaret were married, that I need you to see before the end of the month. The bank is foreclosing on it on the 31st. There's a buyer already lined up. I think you need to know who it is before you decide whether to do anything about it. The sun set over the Quabbin Reservoir. I changed lanes for Newport. I reached Newport at 9:47 that night, and Jonathan was waiting for me in the lobby of the Hyatt on Goat Island with 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder under his arm. He did not waste words. He led me to a quiet corner table by the windows that looked out across the harbor toward the small granite point 3 miles to the east, the point that had carried, for nearly 120 years, the white wooden lighthouse called Magnolia Pines. He laid the folder on the table between us and opened it to the first page. The foreclosure notice was dated November 14th. The lender was a regional bank out of Providence. The property owner of record was a family trust called the Wheelock Trust, established in 1964 by the Reverend Thomas Wheelock. The same Reverend Wheelock who had stood on a small wooden platform on that granite point on a windy afternoon in June of 1975 and married a 21-year-old Margaret Ann Caldwell to a 21-year-old Nathaniel Whitlock in front of 42 guests. a hired bagpiper, and a herring gull, who had taken a personal interest in our reception cake. The Whitlock Trust was 3 months in default. Reverend Whitlock's grandson, a kind, unworldly man named Peter Whitlock, who taught divinity at a small college in New Hampshire, had inherited the lighthouse, the small caretaker's cottage, and 7 acres of granite headland, along with a maintenance obligation that had quietly bankrupted him over the course of 6 years. The auction was set for December 31st. The buyer, Jonathan said, was an LLC called Cliff Point Holdings. He had spent 2 weeks tracing its ownership through 3 layers of Delaware shell entities. Behind the 3rd layer was a hedge fund out of Greenwich, Connecticut, which had filed a preliminary site plan with the Newport Zoning Board to demolish the lighthouse, level the granite point with controlled blasting, and build a single-family residence with 12 bedrooms, an indoor saltwater pool, and a helicopter pad. The site plan was valued at $6.1 million. I sat with the folder for a long time. Jonathan let me sit. He had learned, in the months since the pier, that I needed time the way other men needed counsel. How much to stop it? I asked. Finally, Edgar ran the numbers this morning. A sealed counteroffer at $3.4 million, delivered through Margaret's Light LLC before the auction opens, would have to be considered by the bank under the terms of their foreclosure procedure. Cliff Point Holdings can match it, but the hedge fund's site plan only pencils at acquisition costs under $3 million. Above that, they walk. And the Whitlock family? Peter Whitlock is broken about this, Nathaniel. He told me on the phone yesterday that his grandfather's last instruction to him was to never let the light go dark. I closed the folder. Tell Edgar to file at 3.4, I said. And tell Peter Whitlock to come to Newport on the 38th first. Tell him I have a job for him if he wants it. Edgar filed the counteroffer on Monday morning. Cliff Point Holdings withdrew on Wednesday afternoon. The bank accepted Margaret's Light's bid on Thursday, and the lighthouse and its 7 acres of granite became, on the morning of December 21st, the property of an entity I had spent 6 weeks quietly preparing for exactly this kind of moment. I held the press conference on the granite point itself. On a clear, cold Saturday morning 2 weeks into January, there were 47 people present. Anya Chowdhury, of the Portland Press-Herald, stood at the front with her notebook. 3 television crews had been allowed through the gate. Petty Officer Diaz had driven down from Castle Hill in her dress blues. Edgar stood at my left, in the gray wool coat he had worn to my wedding 50 years before. Jonathan stood at my right, hat in hand. Daniel Halpern had driven up from Hartford with his wife Rebecca and their 2 children, Sam and Hannah, who held their father's hands and stared at the lighthouse the way I had stared at the Zakim Bridge from a tugboat at the age of 7. Peter Whitlock was there, in a borrowed overcoat, looking like a man who had just been told that a sentence he had long since accepted had been commuted. Eloise stood beside me. I read the announcement from a single sheet of paper. The Margaret Whitlock Foundation, I said, had been established to honor a woman who had spent her life carrying weights she did not need to carry alone. It would operate 3 programs. The first was the full restoration and expansion of the Casco Bay Readers Fund, now to serve every literacy gap student in Cumberland County with a starting endowment of $4 million. The second was Margaret's Light, a 42-foot motor yacht donated to the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary as a training vessel for a to-risk youth, operating out of Newport from May through October each year. The third was the preservation of Magnolia Pines Light, which would never be sold, never be demolished, and never go dark. The cottage would house a small year-round maritime education program. Peter Whitlock would serve as its first director. I did not, in that speech, mention God by name. I had never been a man who spoke of God in public, but I said, at the close of the page, that I had come to believe after 50 years at sea and 72 years on this particular shore that some things in the world were given to us not because we had earned them, but because someone had decided, for reasons he had not yet explained, that we would be required to give them away again. The harbor that morning was very still. Eloise spoke after me. She was 16 years old, and she did not use a single note. She talked for 4 minutes about her grandmother, whom she had known only as a face in photographs. And she ended by saying that she intended, when she finished college, to come back to Magnolia Pines and teach children to read the way her grandmother had taught Charlotte. I did not then weep. But I was close. The press conference ended at 12:15. The crowd began to disperse along the gravel path that led back to the gate. I stood for a moment alone at the edge of the granite point, watching the harbor. A young woman approached me. She was perhaps 28 years old, dark-haired, in a long charcoal coat. She held a small white envelope in one gloved hand and a single photograph in the other. "Captain Whitlock," she said, very quietly. "My mother worked for you in 1992. She asked me to give you this. If you ever became a public man." She held out the photograph. The photograph the young woman handed me had been taken in the courtyard of the old Whitlock Maritime building on Commercial Street in 1992, on what looked like a Friday afternoon in late September. The woman in the photograph was wearing a blue cotton dress with a white collar, holding a dark-haired toddler on her hip. She was laughing at something just beyond the frame. I knew, without looking at the back of the photograph, that the thing she had been laughing at was a joke I had told that day, about a foreman from Lubeck who could not, no matter how many times I explained it, remember the difference between port and starboard. Her name had been Teresa Marquez. She had been my executive assistant for 11 years. She had died, in the spring of 1998, of pancreatic cancer, at the age of 41. The toddler on her hip in the photograph was the woman now standing in front of me on the granite point at Magnolia Pines, 28 years old, holding out a small white envelope in a gloved hand. "My mother's name was Teresa," she said. "I'm Camila. I'm a public defender in Boston now. She wrote this letter to you in February of 1998, 3 weeks before she died, and she asked me to keep it until you became a man the world could find." I took the envelope. I did not open it on the granite point. I opened it that night, alone, in Margaret's chair in the parlor at 14 Lighthouse Point Road, with the harbor light pulsing its long signature against the dark water outside the window. Teresa's letter was 1 page. It thanked me for the tuition I had quietly paid for Camila at Boston Latin in 1994, and for the college fund I had set up anonymously after her diagnosis, and for the 3 other children she named them whose educations I had paid for over the years through a small foundation Edgar's office had administered under a name no one had ever connected to me. She wrote that she had never told me she knew. She wrote that she had wanted me to be able to give without being thanked, because she had understood, even then, that the giving was the only part of it I had been willing to keep for myself. She closed by writing, "Captain Whitlock, when the world finally finds you, I hope you will let it. You have spent too long carrying things alone." I sat with the letter for a long time. Then I folded it back into its envelope, and I placed it on the mantelpiece beside Margaret's photograph, and I went upstairs and looked in on Eloise, who was asleep with a geometry textbook open on her chest, and the small reading lamp still on. I turned the lamp off. I closed her door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to a house that, for the first time in 8 years, had 2 breathing people in it. That was the end of the year. I am writing this account from the wheelhouse of Margaret's Light. 6 months later, on a clear morning in early June, the boat is tied at her new mooring in Newport Harbor. In an hour, 14 children from the Roger Williams Middle School in Providence will come aboard for their second lesson in chart reading. Petty Officer Diaz, who has taken a 6-month rotation as our liaison from Station Castle Hill, will teach the knot work. Peter Wheelock will run the lighthouse tour from the Granite Point. Eloise, who turned 17 in April, will be at the helm of the small training sloop tied alongside, having earned her certification 3 weeks ago at the club on Munjoy Hill. If you have stayed with me this long, then I owe you the honest accounting I promised at the beginning, before the lawyer's call at dawn, before the ferry, before the chopsticks and the whiskey, and the cliff that I never walked. Here is what I learned. I learned that the people who love us most are sometimes the ones most willing to carry our weights for us in silence, and that silence, however merciful it feels at the time, is almost always a kind of theft from the people we are trying to protect. I learned that the man you become at 72 is built from every small choice you made at 35 and 40 and 58, and that no amount of money and no number of patents will protect you from the consequences of the ones you got wrong. I learned that a 16-year-old girl with a clear voice and a memory for Morse code can outweigh an entire conspiracy of grown adults with law degrees and luxury yachts. I learned that mercy, when it is offered without weakness, is the most precise instrument an old man can carry. I learned that the brother you stopped speaking to 22 years ago may have been waiting, all that time, for you to give him back his name, and I learned late, but not too late, that a God I have never been able to define with any precision had, perhaps, been writing my story with a steadier hand than I had given him credit for. Charlotte wrote me a letter in March. She is 2 years into her inpatient program in Vermont. I have not yet answered her. I will answer her. In time. There is no schedule for that kind of thing, and I will not be hurried by anyone, including myself. If you are watching this, and there is someone in your life who has been carrying a thing alone that they should not be carrying alone, I would ask you to do one small thing today. Sit with them. Make them a cup of cocoa. Ask the question you have been afraid to ask. The conversation you avoid for 10 years will not become easier in the 11th. And if this story moved you, if it made you think of your own father, your own daughter, your own quiet captain at the kitchen table, please share it with one person who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us about someone in your life who carried something alone. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling stories like this one. And please, please call the person you have been meaning to call. The harbor light is still pulsing. Long, short, long. It always has been. Thank you for listening.